Thank the Prime Minister. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My questions to the Prime Minister. Malcolm Turnbull is no longer Prime Minister of Australia. Why?
Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for his question. John Howard used to say something quite simple, and that is the privilege of serving as the leader of your parliamentary party is the decision of your parliamentary party. That's what it is. That's who decides who the leader of the parliamentary party is, just as it is true that caucus members of the Labor Party decide who the leader of the Labor Party is. Mr Speaker, and on this side of the House, that parliamentary party has made their decision. And it was many years ago, I can recall, at the Sydney Entertainment Centre, where I was listening to a presentation from General Norman Schwarzkopf. And he said this: when placed in command, take charge. And that's what I propose to do, Mr Speaker. Take charge to ensure that we continue the stable government, Mr Speaker, that has delivered the strong economy, that has seen 1 million people come into work since we were elected in 2013, that has seen bulk billing rates rise to record highs under Medicare, to ensure that we're delivering record funding for schools and for hospitals, Mr Speaker, to ensure that we're putting young people in jobs. 95,500 people got a job in 2017-18, Mr Speaker. That is the strongest jobs growth in 30 years for young people.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. Members on both sides will cease interjecting. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
My point of order is relevance. The Australian people deserve an answer. Why did you change the Prime Minister?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his interjection. He must be a little hard of hearing. His ears must be painted on, Mr Speaker, and that's what we see from this Leader of the Opposition. As he roams around the country, he roams around there, he's doing a lot of talking, he's doing a lot of promising, but he's not doing a lot of listening. I made it pretty clear, Mr Speaker. The privilege of serving as the leader of the Liberal Party is a decision of the parliamentary party, and they have made their decision. I have accepted their decision, and more than that, Mr Speaker, I have decided to take charge of that situation and deliver the strong economic growth, the even stronger Australia that we've been delivering now for 5 years, Mr Speaker, and that is three simple points: keeping our economy strong, keeping Australians safe, and keeping Australians together. That's my plan, and Australians will be backing it.
Members cease interjecting. I'm just going to make very clear I realise members are in a mood to interject, but I'm not going to incessantly warn members. I will just simply eject those who are regular offenders. The member for Grey has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. It gives me great pleasure to ask the first question from this side of the chamber of our new Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House? You might learn something. Will the Prime Minister update the House on how the government is helping farmers and rural communities to cope with the devastating effects of drought?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Grey for his question, because in the North-West Pastoral Zone in South Australia, we know that they are experiencing drought. We know the drought is in New South Wales. We know the drought has been for many years in Queensland. We know that it's in Victoria. This is a national problem. It's a national challenge. It's one of the reasons we've appointed the Special Envoy, the member for New England, to be working as part of the team with Manager General Day to coordinate our drought response, our drought recovery program. Mr Speaker, one of the first things I did was to go first-hand with the Deputy Prime Minister to go to those drought-affected areas of Western Queensland. And while it is true there is frustration, and while there is true that I found exhaustion, and while it is true also that I've found disappointment on those that I've met as I've spoken to those affected by drought, not just on the farms but in the towns as well. I'll tell you the other thing I found, and it was hope. There is real hope about where we are going ahead as a country when it comes to dealing with the drought, because I was shown by Steve Tully with his wife Annabelle a picture of a pasture land which had grass up to your knees just 2.5 years ago. And that is what they believe will return. They haven't given up in terms of what they've been doing over this period of time, and Australians haven't given up on them either, Mr Speaker. That's why Jack Byrne from Freshwater Public School has started the Fiver for a Farmer. That's why the kids from St Patrick's Parish School in Albury were busking in the main street to show their solidarity with rural communities all around the country, Mr Speaker, because in this country we look after our mates and we are looking after our farmers, Mr Speaker, and the rural towns. Now, the challenge is great and there's no one single answer. There are many responses that need to be coordinated at a state and at a local level and at a Commonwealth level. And the Major General, Stephen Day, who has been put in charge of a joint agency task force to coordinate the Commonwealth's response, not unlike exactly the joint agency task force that was formed back in 2013 called Operation Sovereign Borders. It is a similar approach, bringing together all agencies of government under a single command to ensure the help gets where it needs to get to and the response is coordinated in the way it needs to, Mr Speaker. That joint agency task force has already been stood up. And the reports coming back to me from Major General Day is that the story is uneven. It's different in different parts of the country. Some people are doing better than we may have expected, but many are doing it worse. On top of that, the generosity that has been provided by charitable organisations all around the country is working, but it needs to be better targeted. Major General Day has a simple plan. He's going to listen, he's going to plan and he's going to act. That's what we're doing to coordinate our response to the drought, to ensure the feed gets where it needs to, the assistance gets to the farmers where it needs to, and we keep those towns alive to ensure we recover.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to my previous question. I ask not how the Prime Minister was replaced, but why.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, the party chooses the person they want to lead to ensure, Mr Speaker, that we can put the best foot forward at the next election to ensure we are connecting with Australians all around the country. Last week I went to Albury, Mr Speaker, and I explained that while our government has been incredibly successful in delivering, whether it's on jobs or whether it's on the economy, or whether it's on getting rid of the carbon tax, Mr Speaker, on whether it's ensuring that we're delivering the nation-building infrastructure, the congestion-building infrastructure. This is a government that has been very strong on the what. But when it comes to the why, I'll tell you why, Mr Speaker, why this government is doing all these things. Because we believe in a fair go for those who have a go. We believe in a social safety net which says Australia's backs their mates. We believe in a country where people come to make a contribution and not take one. We believe the best form of welfare is a job, Mr Speaker. We believe that one Australian to get ahead doesn't have to bring another one down, Mr Speaker. That's what we know. The Leader of the Opposition has a negative plan for Australia. He has no plan to ensure a strong economy. And, you know, if you can't guarantee a strong economy, everything he says, every promise he makes is not believable. It's not believable because he can't pay for it and he doesn't believe in the things that underpin any of the promises that he makes.
The member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on how the government's plan for a stronger economy is working to create more jobs and more opportunities for Australians, and how this is reflected in the most recent national account figures? Is the Prime Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for North Sydney for his question. Last year's national accounts showed that Australia remained at the top of the leaderboard when it came to economic growth around the world. In the terms of the G7 economies, the OECD, Mr Speaker, I hear the interjection from the member for Mark McMahon. We're not in the G7. Well, we all know that. We all know that, Mr Speaker. But isn't it a good thing, the member for McMahon, that Australia's growth rate is greater than all of the world's largest developed economies? I haven't heard the member for McMahon say that growth is a good thing lately, particularly when it comes— I haven't heard him say that, Mr Speaker, because our economy is strong. Our government's policies are continuing to make ensure that it remains strong. And that growth was better than the budget forecast that we handed down just in May of this year. It's better than the estimates that were predicted by the markets, and it shows that in its detail that the big winners out of this growth have been the jobs that are being created. The record jobs growth that we've been seeing in this country under the economic stewardship of the policy of the Liberal and the National parties is putting people into work, Mr Speaker. It's putting people into work. And we're going to keep our economy strong, not just because it gives people a job, and when you have a job you have choices in life. What it does is it ensures that the economy that we're generating can pay for the things that really matter. It means that it can pay for hospitals. It can pay for life-saving affordable medicines, Mr Speaker, for cystic fibrosis, for Spinraza, for those children who have had no prospect of a long life and now have the opportunity for that. It can pay for education. It can pay for Medicare. It can pay for the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And our policies are all designed to give a fair go to those who want to have a go. They're not designed to bring others down, to try and raise others up. We reject the politics of envy when it comes to economic policy and any other type of policy, and that's why we're for lower taxes. We believe those things. That's why we're for lower taxes. We believe Australians should be able to keep more of what they own. Labor wants to increase their taxes, all of their taxes. They want to put them up if they're given that opportunity. It's why we back small business, and we've delivered the single largest boost to small business in their taxation arrangements they've seen in generations, and there'll be more to come, because we believe in small business. The Labor Party wants to increase the taxes on every small business in this country, and if elected, they will. That's why we're for cheaper electricity prices. That's why we're for cheaper gas prices and putting in place the policies which achieve that. That's why we're for congestion-busting infrastructure in our cities. That's why we're for infrastructure that is connecting our rural areas to our ports and to our markets. That's why we're for expanding our markets with free trade agreements like the one we are moving forward on in Indonesia, which I was able to bring to that point just the weekend before last, Mr Speaker. We are a government investing in growth and delivering in growth, and that guarantees the essential services Australians rely on.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that just last week the government's entire infrastructure plan was leaked on Monday, its plan to end conflict with Catholic schools was leaked on Tuesday, its latest corporate tax plan was leaked on Wednesday, and all week there was leaking about the Prime Minister plotting to tear down Malcolm Turnbull? Is this what the Prime Minister said when he said his own government was a Muppet show?
Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. As I said, the curtain's down on that performance, but the long-running performance of the Muppet Show on that side of the House, Mr Speaker, is setting new records. It's setting new records.
Members on both sides.
We don't hold a candle when it comes to their performance. It's the longest-running show in the history of the Australian Parliament on that side of the House, Mr Speaker. But in terms of the issues raised by the member, yes, I can confirm that we have a policy and we have a plan that we're implementing to ensure that we've got congestion-busting infrastructure going all over our cities. I can confirm, Mr Speaker, that as a government we've not only moved on delivering needs-based education funding, but we are making great progress in ensuring that there is absolute certainty that every parent who wants the choice to send their children to an independent school, like I do, I send them there because it reflects my faith, and that's great. I think it's wonderful. Everyone should have that choice, and whether it's a Catholic school or whether it's an independent school or anyone else, I want them to have that choice, and we will make sure that they will have that choice, just like we will ensure that when it comes to religious freedoms, they will be protected in this country under my government, Mr Speaker. I can confirm that we will be moving to ensure that we reduce the tax burden even further on small and medium-sized businesses, and I can confirm that the Labor Party will increase that burden on small and medium-sized businesses, which the member for Batman, remember, says tax is a privilege. It's a privilege. No, when it's weighing down on a business, on a low-income earner, it's a burden. It's a burden that removes their hope and takes them away from the choices that they want to make. My government will deliver the strong economic growth that Australians need to have the choices they want, whether it's congestion busting in our cities that means they can move around, see their families, get to work and get on with their lives. We support Australians living the life of their choice, and we will enable their choices.
Just before I call the member for Melbourne, I'd like to inform the House that we have joining us in the gallery this afternoon the Honourable Jim Lloyd, former Minister and former member for Robertson. On behalf of the House, I extend a welcome to you, and I also inform the House we have joining us the Honourable David Simmons, former Minister and former member for Calare. On behalf of the House, I extend a warm welcome to you as well, and I call the member for Melbourne.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. When I asked him on 27th of March this year, the Minister for Home Affairs categorically ruled out any personal connection or other relationship with the intended employers in the au pair stories. And he went on to say, quote, "I don't know these people." But he later publicly confirmed he does know one of them, calling him a former police colleague that he worked with over a period of 2 years. TV News aired a photo, apparently, of the two of them together. And this morning in Parliament, the minister even implied they spoke to each other while working together, but simply hadn't spoken since that time. Prime Minister, hasn't the minister clearly misled Parliament? Isn't this a clear breach of your ministerial standards, and will you now dismiss him?
The Prime Minister has the call.
No.
The member for Flynn.
My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Minister update the House on how the government is supporting communities affected by drought by partnering with local councils to help farmers, families and communities? Is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of any different suggestions that would not provide the same level of assistance to our farmers?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for Flynn for his question. And I hear those, and it's a question about drought, and I hear those opposite calling out Wagga Wagga. Yes, you'll be pleased to know that last Thursday in Wagga Wagga there was 27 millimetres of rain. That's going to provide some ability for those farmers to get a crop off. Many of the farmers in New South Wales, Queensland, indeed Victoria, are not going to get a crop off, and we should be mindful of them. When yelling across the chamber, we should be mindful of all of those farmers, of all of those rural businesses. But at least some of the farmers have a bit of a green sheen around their electorates, and certainly Wagga Wagga, it rained last Thursday. So thank you for your interest in that. The member for Flynn, like all of us, is working hard to support the farmers, indeed the families and the small businesses and communities across Queensland who are doing it tough. And I know his electorate borders Maranoa. It's very dry in Maranoa. The Minister for Agriculture and Water Resources is doing an outstanding job representing those farming communities. To date, the government has pledged $1.8 billion. $1.8 billion in drought support, in 3 tranches of support in measures such as cash on the table to help farming families to pay for some groceries, to pay for some bills. Indeed, those amounts are $12,000 for a couple, and single households up to $7,200. The first of which will be in October. The second payment from March next year. More support for rural financial counsellors, so very important to as far as getting out those people who can help people with mental health. Increasing eligibility for farm household assistance, additional investment in water and fodder storage. An announcement made at HE Silos. Now, there's a great family business, a third-generation family business started by Ivan and Patsy Morrison in Hilston in 1969. It's an Australian-owned family business. As I say, third generation. It's got factories in both Forbes and Gunnedah. It builds silos. It makes kit silos, superphosphate silos, 60-degree cone silos, field bins, cattle and sheep feeders. Great little company. Their son, Darryl, who manages the Gunnedah factory, and Stephen, he manages the Forbes plant with their wives Cheryl Lee and Jennifer. Now they've got the third generation coming along. The kids are taking part in that business. They employ up to 70 staff. Up to 70 staff. They're the sort of businesses that are helping out with the drought. They're the sort of community resilience building family companies that we need to really support in the drought. We don't need our farmers to be told what they can do, where they can farm and how they can farm. That's what the member for Hunter has done in recent times. Farmers don't need to listen to that, member for Hunter. I'll tell you that now.
Prime Minister's time. has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to the standards required of ministers under the ministerial standards. Is the Prime Minister aware that the member for Leichhardt has today called for the bullies within his government to be named and held accountable for their actions? What process has the Prime Minister commenced to assure himself that none of his ministers or assistant ministers are guilty of bullying or intimidation their Liberal colleagues in breach of ministerial standards?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I had a chat with the member for Leichhardt today, and I know he's fully satisfied with the way that the party is managing all issues that are germane to the internal running of the Liberal Party and the support of all colleagues. Mr Speaker, we have a very clear process for handling the welfare of our members. It's handled by our whips, as I'm sure as it's handled in this chamber by the opposition, by their party whips. They have a pastoral care role when it comes to issues of management with colleagues, and our chief whip has served as a whip in this parliament, the member for Forrest, for the last 11 years, and I particularly want to welcome the appointment of a new deputy whip in the Senate, in Senator Hume, who will also be part of that task. But what I won't do, Mr Speaker, is take lectures from the Leader of the Opposition on bullying. I'm not going to take lectures from a Leader of the Opposition who could not have a warmer embrace with John Setka, the head of the Victorian CMFMEU, Mr Speaker. I mean, if they were any closer, they'd be Siamese twins, Mr Speaker. But I don't join at the head, join at the hip and join at the heart, Mr Speaker.
Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, the Labor Party, when it comes to bullying and intimidation, I remember Peter Baldwin. I remember seeing Peter Baldwin, Mr Speaker. Now, I'll tell you why I'm talking about Peter Baldwin. Because my introduction as a young person to the Labor Party was seeing his bashed face on the television, Mr Speaker. So I won't be taking lectures from the Labor Party.
Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business, the Prime Minister has indicated he's concluded his answer. The member for Newcastle will leave under 94A. The member for Robertson has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the Minister update the House on steps the government is taking to keep Australian families safe? How would different ideas make our communities less secure?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for her question. Mr Speaker, the Morrison government is absolutely committed to keeping our borders secure and to keeping our Australian communities safe. Mr Speaker, under this government we have cleaned up Labor's mess. We know that 50,000 people arrived on 800 boats, and we know, Mr Speaker, that 1,200 people tragically drowned at sea, and that Labor and the Greens, when they were in government together, put 8,000 children into detention, Mr Speaker. Now, we've got those children out of detention. We've closed 17 detention centres. We have provided support to people who are genuinely in need of protection from a country like ours. Last year, we brought in more people under the Refugee and Humanitarian Program than any year in the last 3 decades. And we've done that because we have a well-managed border protection program, Mr Speaker. Now, as Australians realise, the people smugglers have not gone away, and we've spoken a lot about it over a long period of time. The people smugglers are still in Indonesia, in Sri Lanka, in Vietnam, elsewhere across the Middle East and around the world, seeking to take money from innocent men, women and children to put them onto boats to come to this country. Now, Mr Speaker, we did see an arrival of a vessel which was flagged out of Vietnam, holding 17 people land in the Daintree. And I want to inform the House, Mr Speaker, that the 17 people off that vessel have now been returned back to Vietnam.
On his watch.
We have dealt with the issue, Mr Speaker. We have surged our naval assets, and we've surged our assets in terms of aerial surveillance as well. And this government, Mr Speaker, will do whatever we need to do to stop those boats, to make sure that we don't see women and children drowning at sea again, like they did when Labor was last in government, like they would do again if Labor was elected at the next election, because they have learned nothing at all from the past, Mr Speaker. At the same time that we've done all of that, we have been reassured, Mr Speaker, of the steps the government has taken to cancel visas in relation to criminals, and in particular to outlaw motorcycle gang members. And I can update the House that we have cancelled the visas of 194 outlaw motorcycle gang members who are the biggest distributors of amphetamine and ice in communities across the country. And, Mr Speaker, we predict, or the ACIC actually predicts, that has saved 1,000 Australians from falling victim to members of outlaw motorcycle gangs. Because not only are they big distributors of drugs, but they are in lockstep with the CFMEU and with other organised criminal organisations who are involved in extortion and assaults, all sorts of criminal activity that you would expect from the CFMEU. 75 of them have been charged in relation to these matters, Mr Speaker. This government will keep our borders secure and we will keep Australians safe.
The Minister's time has concluded. Member for McEwen will just cease interjecting. The member for Ballarat.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Can the minister confirm that the last time this House met, he supported a Turnbull government on Monday, voted for a Dutton government on Tuesday, said he supported a Turnbull government on Wednesday, called for a Dutton government on Thursday and pledged his loyalty to a Morrison government on Friday? Can the minister confirm when he told the House he supported Malcolm Turnbull, he'd already decided to support someone else? What is the minister's response to the Prime Minister describing his behaviour as like being the Muppet Show?
I haven't called the minister yet. Members on both sides, members on my left, I don't particularly think the question's in order, but I can see the minister's prepared to answer it, so I'll give him the call.
I am very prepared to answer this because, oddly enough, this is an opposition that cannot even raise the will to ask a question about health, cannot raise the will to ask a question about the PBS, cannot raise the will to ask a question about medical research. And you know why? Because they're ashamed. They're ashamed of what they did when, in the 2011 budget, they pulled the plug on the listing of new medicines. And one of the reasons why I have a deep and profound belief in this Prime Minister, in this man, in this individual, is because he put together a $1.3 billion health and medical research plan. And this was a plan with $248 million for clinical trials to help people have access to medicines who would otherwise never get it. It was a plan with $242 million for a new frontier science program and a plan with $500 million for a national genomics mission, which, amongst other things, will help young families aspiring to have children have genomic testing as part of Mackenzie's mission, which the Prime Minister talked about the day after the budget, so as they could tell whether there was any prospect that they are likely to have the combination of markers that would lead to children being born with cystic fibrosis, SMA or Fragile X, amongst other genetic conditions. And this is the same Prime Minister who invested and helped create a $1 billion contingency fund for PBS drugs. And why would he have needed to have done that? Because the previous government stopped listing medicines. The previous government, in their 2011 budget, because they couldn't pay for it, deliberately deferred the listing of new medicine until fiscal circumstances would permit. Just remember that, until fiscal circumstances would permit. So one of the things that he did as Treasurer was that he helped create those fiscal circumstances.
Minister for Health will resume his seat. Minister for Health will resume his seat. The member for Grayndler on a point of order. Member for Grayndler on a point of order. State the point of order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It goes to relevance. The question was about the misleading of Parliament. It's a very serious issue to accuse a minister of. If you mislead Parliament, you have to resign your position. The minister needs to respond to the question.
Seat. The Leader of the House on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, the question didn't mention the misleading of Parliament, and the member for Grayndler knows. The member for Grayndler knows that if there's such an allegation, it needs to be moved by a substantive motion, not asked as a question by the member for Ballarat.
The Leader of the House will resume his seat. Look, I'll deal with this matter very swiftly. As I said, I didn't particularly think the question was in order myself, certainly on the basis of what I've advised members numerous times about the content of the whole 30-second question. The majority of it was not in order. Nonetheless, the minister was prepared to answer it, so I allowed that course. If we're now going to get into a tit-for-tat over the content of the answer, I will be more strict on the questions. That's why I'm giving the minister latitude.
In the end, Mr Speaker, this Prime Minister has done more in the raising of funds for allowing new medicines to be listed than arguably any other person in the history of this parliament, and it compares with that side, which in the end you always know, because they can't manage the economy, you can't trust them to list your medicines.
The member for Tangney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy. Will the minister update the House on how the government is focused on driving power prices down and producing results, particularly for small businesses, families and older Australians? How would alternative approaches hurt Australian families by putting ideology over price?
The Minister for Energy has the call.
Excellent, Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Tangney for his question. And I recognise his keen interest in this all-important subject and issue for those on this side of the parliament, because we want to see lower prices for electricity, for households, for small businesses, for large businesses across our electorates. We see the impact of higher electricity prices for households, for small businesses, for large businesses like aluminium smelters and cement manufacturers, Mr Speaker. But as the Minister for bringing electricity prices down, I can assure you, I can assure this House that this government's priority, my priority, the Prime Minister's priority, is to get power prices down while we keep the lights on. Now, Mr Speaker, I do need to pay tribute to the good work of my predecessor, the Treasurer. Under his leadership, we have seen power prices coming down, and across south-east Queensland, New South Wales and South Australia on the 1st of July this year, we saw price reductions across the board. For instance, in south-eastern Queensland, Powershop reduced its prices for households by 8.6%. That's $140 for a typical household. We saw a 14.6% reduction in the charges for small businesses, and for a typical small business, that's a $1,400 reduction in cost, something that those opposite will never understand because so few of them have ever worked in a small business, Mr Speaker. But there's more to be done. There's more to be done, and that's why we're taking practical action to bring down electricity prices. That means stopping the price gouging by energy companies. It means providing customers with a fair price safety net. It means backing investment in fair dinkum reliable generators that keep the lights on to provide more competition and lower prices, Mr Speaker. Now, we are not afraid, Mr Speaker, to use a big stick on big energy companies if that's what's required. We're not afraid to do it. And we know that switching from a standing offer to the cheapest offer can mean savings of over $800, up to $800 for a household. Now, the member asked about alternative approaches. And we do have an alternative approach from those opposite, and that is a 50% renewable energy target and a 45% emissions reduction target. That's going to mean more subsidies, higher prices paid by every energy user and taxpayer in Australia. And if you want to know the evidence for this, just look at South Australia. The member for Port Adelaide knows this, amongst the highest electricity prices in the world, with a 50% renewable energy target, and for that you would expect service. But no, they're struggling to keep the lights on. We are the government for lower electricity prices, in contrast to those opposite.
The member for Port Adelaide.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy. Can the minister confirm that the last time this House met, he supported a Turnbull government on Monday, voted for a Dutton government on Tuesday, said he supported a Turnbull government again on Wednesday, called for a Dutton government again on Thursday and pledged loyalty to a Morrison government on Friday? Can the minister confirm when he told the House he supported Malcolm Turnbull, he'd already decided to support someone else and was misleading Parliament?
The Leader of the House on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, the first reason this question should be ruled out of order is because accusing a minister of misleading the House can only be done by substantive motion, not in a question.
Members on my left, I want to hear the point of order. If members don't allow me to hear the point of order, I'll simply eject them. The Leader of the House has
the second reason, Mr Speaker, that this question should be ruled out of order is it's about matters to do with the parliamentary party, and traditionally, of course, those matters have not been within the responsibility, the ministerial responsibility of members, and therefore they should not be questioned about them.
Okay, I'll rule on the point of order. I'm ready to rule on the point of order. I disagree with the Leader of the House on the term misleading. The term deliberately misleading is the trigger point that he is referring to, and there are many instances where the word misleading has been used in questions and indeed in answers by ministers. Referring to the minister's previous answer is obviously the substantive point, but it's not the substantive part of that question. And whilst it was there, it was the last line. I've said before I'm not going to allow a whole range of material as commentary in the 30 seconds and just bolt on at the very end, in the last instance, the only part of the question that's in order. On that basis, I'm going to rule the question out of order, not on the basis the Leader of the Opposition said, and I'll call the next question. The member for Fisher.
My question is to the Minister for Jobs and Industrial Relations. Will the minister update the House on how the government is helping everyday Australians find work and keep more of their own hard-earned money? Is the minister aware of any threats posed by different approaches?
The Minister has the call.
I thank the member for Fisher for his question. The Coalition stands for jobs, for economic growth and for lower taxes, which means more money going into the hard-working pockets of everyday Australians. We have reduced the tax rates, the personal income tax rates for individuals. We have lowered the tax rates.
The Minister will just pause for a second. Members on my left, I've warned about interjecting. There's many I warn every day, several times a day. One of them is the member for Wakefield, who I've asked to cease interjecting today. I think he knows what follows next. He can leave under 94A. The Minister has the call.
We've lowered tax rates for small, medium and family-sized enterprises, and we have taken important steps to restore law and order to the critically important building and construction sector. This is, despite those opposite doing their very best to defend the militant union thugs and their criminal associates. It is thanks to the Coalition's economic plan that job growth is at record levels. Over 400,000 jobs created in 2017, with 3/4 of those jobs being full-time jobs. Unemployment is down, and women's participation continues to see record highs, and pleasingly we have seen 95,000 young Australians find employment in 2017-2018, the best result in almost 30 years. But by contrast, those opposite have seen, in their final year in office, youth employment going backwards, with losses of around 16,000 job losses. And we all know that if you cannot get that first job, it is very hard to get the second, third and fourth job. Now, the member asks about threats. Make no mistake that the Leader of the Opposition would hand the keys to our economy to his comrades in the militant mega-union, the CFMEU. It is an organisation that proudly boasts about the fact that they have run up $16 million worth of penalties, $1 million in this financial year alone. It has been described by a federal court judge as the most recidivist corporate offender in Australian history, with office holders having been convicted of serious offences that include assault, trespass and theft, to name just a few. This Leader of the Opposition would give the militant CFMEU free rein to abuse, threaten and intimidate workers and small businesses right across the country. No more fines, no more penalties if the Leader of the Opposition would have his way. Now, he says that he has zero tolerance for union bad behaviour,
But unlike Bob Hawke, he refuses to stand up to the militant extremists within the union movement. Now, we on this side are getting on with the job of running the economy. We are getting more Australians into more jobs. We are ensuring that they have more money in their pocket. The Leader of the Opposition would put militant unions first and workers and small businesses last.
The minister's time has concluded. And the member for Chifley has the call.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Human Services. Can the minister confirm that when he told the House he supported Malcolm Turnbull on Monday and Wednesday, he had already decided to support someone else and he therefore had misled Parliament?
The Leader of the House.
Well, Mr Speaker, again, I would direct you to the standing orders and the parliamentary practice with respect to the responsibilities of the minister, and particularly, of course, in page 553, that ministers should not be asked questions about party leadership and related issues where there's no connection with a matter in respect of which the minister is responsible to the House.
Yeah, and I think the I'm happy to rule on the question now. It might save a bit of time. Yeah, well, you might do better this time. The Leader of the House is quite right, and I'm very familiar with the 7th edition of practice, and obviously I've considered all these matters in advance. The difference here is once a minister has answered a question, it's quite, I mean, he'd be right in the normal course of events, but it's quite in order for that previous answer to be asked about again, and that's what's been done on this occasion. So I'm going to allow the question to stand and call the minister.
Well, I've had 2 questions from the Shadow Minister and not one about policy. Not one about policy. So while they want to play inside baseball, we're getting on with the job of serving the Australian people. Last week I was with the member for O'Connor in his electorate in Kalgoorlie, in Leonora and Laverton, and we went to the local Aboriginal Medical Service and we saw the work that was being done in my portfolio by Australian Hearing. Now, 10 years ago, when the Labor Party were in office, 1 in 10 kids under 5 were getting their hearing tested in remote communities. 1 in 10 kids under 5. Now, under this government, it's 1 in 4 kids under 5 in remote communities getting their hearing tested. That means we can intervene early and make sure that if children need the assistance that they need to get their hearing right, we will give it to them. We also went and spoke to the local councils in Leonora, Laverton and Kalgoorlie about the cashless debit card. Now, what we heard from local police officers, what we heard from local stakeholders, what we heard from people that provide social services in those towns is that alcohol abuse is down, drug abuse is down and antisocial behaviour is down.
The minister will resume his seat for a second. The member for Barton will cease interjecting. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Yeah, on direct relevance, Speaker.
Yeah, the Manager of Opposition Business will resume his seat. I do have to say, when it came to the question to the Minister for Health, which I didn't believe was particularly in order, I allowed him to answer. It was a much longer question with a whole lot of other elements. This is a shorter and more tighter question, and the minister needs to be relevant to it. And it was really one straight question that didn't go to the matters he's now raising. So he needs to bring himself to the answer, and he's not compelled, of course, as I always point out, to take the entire 3 minutes. The minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, the Australian people want us to get on with the job. That's exactly what we're doing. With services like I was talking about, I support the cashless debit card. Those that don't should go and see it for themselves, the impact it's having in those communities.
The member for Cowper.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Would the minister update the House on how the government is continuing to be in a financial position to subsidise life-changing medicines such as Orkambi for cystic fibrosis? How does our approach differ from past approaches?
The Minister for Health has the call.
We pay for it. Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And I want to thank the member for Cowper, who's been amongst with people on all sides, a great advocate for the listing of Orkambi. This is a medicine for cystic fibrosis. And he does ask whether or not there are alternative approaches, and I'll deal with that first. We know that the history is that for many years there has been support for the listing of new medicines, with the exception of 2011, when the then government, and I simply quote from their budget papers, said, due to fiscal circumstances, the listing of some medicines would be deferred until fiscal circumstances permit. What that meant was, we can't pay for it, so we won't list it. We can't manage the economy, says Labor in 2011, so we won't give people access to new medicines for deep vein thrombosis, for IVF, for schizophrenia, for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. These were their decisions, with real-world consequences when you can't manage the economy. Fortunately, we are in a dramatically different place. What we have seen is a turnaround in the economy under the very careful hand of the coalition and, in particular, the Prime Minister. We've seen 1 million jobs created, and that has put the budget in a far stronger position. So as we can guarantee that every medicine that is listed, that is recommended by the PBAC, we will proceed and we will make sure that it can be listed. What I do want to note, in particular in relation to the medicine Orkambi and cystic fibrosis, is 8 days ago I was privileged to join the Prime Minister in his first major announcement on health to recognise that Orkambi had been recognised by the PBAC, and within a few short weeks we were able to list it. It had been raised by the member for Mayo, it had been raised by the member for Forrest, it had been raised by members on the other side, and indeed I mentioned the member for Lilly previously. And what we've seen is that this medicine will help 1,200 beautiful young Australian children and young adults have access to life-changing medicine. Overall, it will lead in some cases to an additional 20 years of life for a medicine which would otherwise have cost up to $250,000, and virtually no Australian family could afford $250,000 a year. And this medicine, in particular, will mean that young children have access to a capacity to have a future which they would otherwise not have had. And I can't summarise it better than the words of Kate Daly, who met with the Prime Minister and myself, 14 years old and unbelievably eloquent. What she said was, that night that Orkambi had been approved, I was just a world of emotions. I was so happy, so excited and so grateful. So happy that I would have access to a drug that would, for the first time, stop the slow failure of my lungs. There couldn't have been a better outcome.
The member for Blair.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Today the Minister said that the employer of the Brisbane au pair wrote an email to the Minister's publicly available email account. Will he table that email now? And if he doesn't have it with him, will he provide it to the Parliament by 5 p.m. today?
The Minister for Home Affairs has the call.
Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question. I don't have the email with me, but I'm happy to table it.
The member for Dunkley has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Cities, Urban Infrastructure and Population. Will the Minister update the House on how the government is investing in congestion-busting infrastructure, including in my electorate of Dunkley? Is the Minister aware of any different approaches to building the roads and infrastructure that Australians rely on?
The Minister for Cities.
Well, can I thank the member for Dunkley for his question? And the Prime Minister and I had a great visit to his electorate just last week to discuss some local congestion-busting projects, as well as the Baxter line, which I'll come to in a second. But, Mr Speaker, this government has $75 billion worth of congestion-busting initiatives going on right now across the nation. Now, that consists of hundreds of small-scale little projects at localised level. Things like the Mount Dandenong Road Tourist Road, Mr Speaker, which you'd be familiar with in your electorate, but also major infrastructure projects in every city, in every state, across the nation. Now, that consists of the Bruce Highway, of course. It consists of the Monash Freeway in Victoria. It consists of the Tullamarine upgrade. It consists of Midland Highway in Tasmania, the North-South Corridor in Adelaide, the Metronet in Perth, the Western Sydney Airport, over $5 billion put into that. All of these major infrastructure projects designed to bust congestion. Now, Mr Speaker, I'm asked about projects in the member for Dunkley's electorate, and he has been an outstanding advocate for the upgrade of what is known as the Frankston to Baxter line. And what that will do, Mr Speaker, is will duplicate the line, upgrade it and also electrify it, effectively putting it onto the Metro rail. And what that means, Mr Speaker, if indeed the business case, once it analyses it, it will mean that things like it will mean an extra station which goes at Frankston East, which I know that the member for Dunkley has strongly supported, and it means that that will link up to the Monash University campus down there, as well as the Frankston Hospital. That will take cars off the road, it will ease up the car parking in those particular locations, and local people can jump on the train and get to those destinations. Indeed, Monash themselves believe that this will increase enrolments at the Peninsula campus by 20%. Simply by having that rail line electrified and having a train stop there. Of course, it will address parking issues as well. I'm asked for alternatives, Mr Speaker, and I'm very pleased that the state opposition has agreed to match our $225 million commitment. What we haven't seen yet, though, Mr Speaker, is the state Labor government also commit to seeing this done. We have, by the way, we have seen the federal opposition commit to the project, but guess what? There's not a dollar attached to it. A classic Labor opposition here commits to something, doesn't put a dollar to it. If you want the Baxter Rail done, you have to support the coalition federally and at the state level of Victoria.
The member for Isaacs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Section 44 of the Constitution provides that any person who has a financial interest in an agreement with the Commonwealth is disqualified from sitting in Parliament. Is the Prime Minister aware of a letter sent to a childcare centre owned by the Minister for Home Affairs Family Trust which says, and I quote, "This approval letter, together with the conditions of funding, makes up the agreement between the Commonwealth and you"? When will the Prime Minister refer the Home Affairs Minister to the High Court so that doubts about his qualifications to be a Member of Parliament under Section 44 of the Constitution can be resolved?
The Prime Minister.
Speaker, and I'll ask the Attorney-General to add to my answer. And the short answer is that those matters were understood by the Solicitor-General at the time of the previous advice being prepared. Mr Speaker, I'll ask the Attorney-General to speak more on this, but I'll tell you what I'm not going to allow, Mr Speaker. The Australian people have had a gutful of these games. They want us to get on with business, and that's what my government is going to do. Attorney-General.
The member for Barker. The member for Barker will cease interjecting. The Attorney-General has the call.
So, Mr Speaker, I thank the member through the Prime Minister for the question. Of course, the history to this is that Labor commissioned an advice from Mr Walker and Mr Mack. That advice made a conclusion, not a conclusion shared by 3 other pieces of public advice that are now available. The Solicitor-General's advice, in fact, dealt with the very agreement that you've spoken about. What Labor now contend, Mr Speaker, what Labor now contend is that the conclusion contained in the Walker and Mack advice is absolutely critical to the integrity of this parliament. Now, if that is so, and if the conclusion contained in the Labor advice is so absolutely critical to the integrity of this parliament, there's one very obvious and very important question that requires answering before we proceed any further, and that is, why did Labor wait 126 days before deciding to provide that advice to the parliament? And when you look at the cover page of that advice that's now oh so important, the date written on Mr Walker and Mr Mack's advice is 18 April 2018. It was sent to me as Attorney-General 126 days later, late on the evening of 22 August 2018. If any of us here, as members of parliament, thought that we had information truly critical to the integrity of this parliament, do you think we would sit on it for 126 days? What happened?
The member for Braddon.
It couldn't be the case that someone as learned as the Shadow Attorney-General took 126 days to read it. Jack Kerouac
Jack Gilroy wrote a whole best-selling novel in 3 weeks. Members of Parliament, what happened, Shadow Attorney General? So important, you had to sit on it for 126 days? Surely, if any of us truly believed that we had information that critical to the Parliament, that important, striking at the heart of the integrity of this fine institution, that we would abide by our duty to this Parliament to disclose it to the Parliament. I mean, Mr Speaker, 3 members of the Labor Party sat on an entire parliamentary committee into Section 44, 7 public hearings, and we're meant to believe that they had advice that they believed utterly critical to this issue and didn't disclose it to this Parliament. Give us a break.
The member for Gilmore.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is for the Minister for Education. Will the minister update the House on how the government is providing vital support and funding for students, parents and teachers? Is the minister aware of any alternate ideas about supporting the education of our young Aussies?
The Minister for Education. The minister has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for her question. As she knows, the best start in life is a good education, from childcare through to university. This government is providing record funding for education, record funding for childcare,
Deputy Leader of the Opposition, the member for Grayndler.
For schools, record funding for higher education. The government wants to deliver better results for students, greater support for teachers and clear advice to parents on how their child is performing. In short, we are providing record funding, but we will also target that funding to improve results and put in place measures to keep track of those results. It's why we are providing more subsidised childcare for families who work the hardest and more financial support for families who earn the least. It's why we believe that NAPLAN is necessary for parents as well as teachers. We want to see how students are progressing across their time at school. It's why we are working through the 23 recommendations provided by David Gonski to improve results from our classrooms for students and better support our teachers. It's why we will make sure that if you decide to study at university, we will reward institutions who deliver better results for students. Our record funding will be matched by a focus on results. We want to make sure that we get better grades, not abolish grades. Without grades, how would we mark a geography student who didn't know that Africa is a country, a nation? Without grades, how would we mark an English student who didn't know the meaning of the word aspiration? Without grades, how would we mark a mathematics student who provided 3 figures over 3 days on their higher education policy? How would we do that without grades? We want to make sure that we're looking after our children's future. We want to make sure that our education systems means that they will get the results that they need to go on and have proper, meaningful employment outcomes. We want to make sure that they will know how to spell, that they will know how to add up, that they will know how to ensure that they can have the best futures possible. That is what we are about, and that is what our education policies will deliver.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
I thank the Prime Minister.